the dominant kind of religious practitioner in California is called by anthropologists a shaman. Shaman were usually men, but they could also be women, and they were people that had access to various supernatural powers and forces within their culture. And the more powerful a shaman became, the older in their life, the more they worked at it, the more of these individual powers and forces they controlled. And what shamans did for the California people was that they were their primary defense against disease, both from the point of view of diagnosing disease, but also for fighting it. And also they were the primary explanation for disease, in the sense that within California worldviews, most human injury and disease had kind of a cause that was in some way attributed to either injuring some personality in the supernatural or some kind of vengeance on the part of some other human who was sending this misfortune through a shaman. So I'm going to say a little bit about that and how California ideas about health and healing and physical renewal are also connected in some ways to the ideas that come out in the flood myth. Water is also connected to California ideas of death. The land of the dead for many California people was somewhere out in the water. And there are a lot of different ways in which funeral ritual and so forth among California Indians uses the symbolism of water in some way to account for where souls go or why souls go there, or what happens to souls after death and so forth. There's also a theme among many California Indian people as to why their particular societies are constructed, the theme that again ties into the events of the original myth, the original flood story, the struggle between land and water, and the creatures that lived in the water and the creatures that lived on the land. And these ideas in a way infiltrate the ideas about human society, how human society is set up, what kinds of kinship groups, what kinds of geographical groups, for example, the society is organized into. In other words, their way of classifying nature, the physical environment, the physical landscape, animals, people, and the rest of that, all of that ties in with the world that gets set up in their creation mythology. So I'm going to try to give you an idea of all of that before the day is over. Following that, the California Indians were, of course, very practical people. They didn't simply live in a world of coyotes, myth stories, and Earthmaker stories, and so forth. They knew the California landscape probably better than anyone will ever know it forever after. As Professor Nara Simmons had said, they lived here for 10,000, maybe even 20,000 years, a long, long time. And you can probably reflect on how intimately you knew your backyard as a child, or how intimately you knew your neighborhood, and the route that you took to school, and the route that you took to some playground and so forth. These things are in your memory and you know them really, really well, and as long as you live, you'll always recall that. Well, if you assume that California Indians lived in tiny little tribelet communities, as they were called, and that they lived there basically where their ancestors lived, and that one generation after another, after another, after another had been living in this same 50 square mile, 75 square mile, maybe 100 square mile territory over and over and over again for 10,000 years, you would begin to get some idea of how intimately they understood the landscape in which they lived. The stones, the trees, the colors of the rocks, the seasons, anything, the animal species that thrived in their landscape and so forth, the rhythms of the year. They understood these kinds of movements as well as anyone possibly could. And I think that any attempt that we have at understanding the California environment through scientific and botanical and biological and the rest of the ways in which we try to understand things, certainly, I mean, we learn a lot that way, but I think the intimacy of it, the detailed understanding of it, is something that California had in a way that we can't, I think, even really possibly understand. So anyway, what I want to say is that there are also some practical ways in which they made use of water. It's not all just flood stories and so forth. They drank it and they did other things, but we'll see a little bit about that. Finally, I have hundreds and hundreds of slides on California Indians, taken out of illustrations in the Bancroft Library and photographs that I've taken around the state and archives that I've combed all over the country and other parts of the world. And so I went through those and I picked out what seemed to be the most interesting ones I could find on California Indians and water, that have water in the picture. And so at the very end, we'll just take a look, we'll take a ride through those slides and see how they look. First, I just want to say a quick word about California Indians. You can't, as I say, you can't generalize about them. There are 310,000 or so people estimated to have lived in California. Extraordinarily complex from the point of view of languages. There were 100 or so mutually unintelligible languages spoken in California. There were probably something on the order of about 500 little tribelet communities. In terms of size, say 10 miles across, 15 miles across, 20 miles across, 25 miles across. By and large, the more intense the resources, the smaller the tribelet, because the less needed to make a living. The more arid the environment, the fewer the resources, the larger the tribelet, the more dispersed they were, because the more they needed to make a living. But the point is that the state was divided up into, wasn't a state then, but this area was all divided up into these little principalities. They made their livings by the ways that we all know. They hunted land mammals, water mammals, deer, rabbits, for example, bear were certainly important. Seal and sea otter were important. Fresh and saltwater fish, geese, ducks, shellfish along most of coastal California and in the coastal estuaries were really, really important at different points in California's history. And as you'll see when you drive down 880, you see a sign that says Shellfish, no, it says Shell Mound Avenue in Emeryville, just simply as a kind of a historical survival of the fact that the whole city of Emeryville was at one time a Native American shell midden. In fact, the whole coastline of the San Francisco Bay Area is lined with these shell middens, where generation after generation California lived, opened their clams and oysters, threw them over their shoulder, and the things piled up into these huge middens. And there's even one here on the campus, back of the faculty club, Strawberry Creek. This life was interrupted in 1542 by a boat full of characters that the Native Americans had never seen before. It was a group of soldiers, slaves, merchants, clergymen, accompanying Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo, who is sailing from the western coast of Mexico, looking for the channel that was going to connect the Pacific to the Atlantic, and looking for cities of gold, and looking for all the things that people spent their lives looking for in those days. So Cabrillo in 1542 passed by California, and he, as far as we know, was the first European to have ever sailed into this area, and they were the first Europeans, as far as we know, to actually have gotten off their ships and in some way interacted with Native American people. That was 1542, 1543. The missions were established, as Professor Narasimhan noted, in 1769 when the Franciscan Fathers came up in a series of expeditions from Baja California, created Mission San Diego and the Presidio at San Diego, and then moved up the coastline, eventually creating a series of religious and military communities divided up into 4 presidial districts. There was the Presidio at San Diego, the Presidio at Santa Barbara, the Presidio at Santa Barbara, Monterey, and the Presidio at San Francisco. So that was sort of the political organization of early Spanish, and the missions were then located in each of these 4 Presidio districts. And so the southernmost was San Diego, and the northern was Mission Sonoma. The northernmost and also the last, and the next to last, of course, was Mission San Rafael. So a huge expansion then of European peoples and Mexican European derived peoples up and down the California coast after 1769. Prior to that, there were a number of other voyages. Francis Drake's to Point Reyes is probably the most famous of all of these. In 1769, Francis Drake visited Point Reyes, and he spent some time there fixing up his ship, the Golden Hind, unloaded a bunch of stolen goods from the Spanish Manila trade, the Manila galleon trade on the Pacific. Francis Drake had traveled around the Pacific just simply finding Spanish ships stealing what it was that he wanted and then throwing overboard the things that he had previously stolen, where he had stolen other things that were better, and he made space for the things that were better. He threw over the things that weren't quite as good. So the result was that around the Point Reyes area there, the Native American villages have large quantities of Ming period china dating from Drake's visit there when these things were thrown overboard, but also other shipwrecks as well through time. So anyway, this is the beginning of the contact of California Indian people with Europeans. While Europeans were coming across the Atlantic, another whole colonization was in process coming across Siberia. The Russian America Company, Tsarist Russia, spread down as far south as Fort Ross. So there was a Russian colony here on the coast of California, largely concerned with sea otter hunting, all the way from Northern California down to Baja California. Established in 1811. The missions closed in the 1830s. That was the beginning, really, the climax of the Mexican Rancho period in California. The mission economies closed, the Native Americans were dispersed, and the main economy of California then became raising cattle. And throughout the Sacramento Valley, the San Joaquin Valley, the coastal areas of California where the missions had huge, huge longhorn cattle herds. They were slaughtered for their hides and for tallow. This is all sent back to London. Most shoes in Boston in those days were made out of California cow hides and so forth. The price that California Indians paid for this was enormous. By the end of the gold rush, by the turn of the 19th and the 20th century, that population of 310,000 or so people was down to about 15 or 20,000. Large numbers had been killed by diseases in the missions. Large numbers had just simply died by displacement and starvation. The gold rush was particularly traumatic because during that time, even the most inaccessible and remote parts of California, the Sierras, for example, were completely penetrated by Americans and Chileans and French and Belgian and Irish and South Americans and people from all over, any place you can imagine. Ran all over California looking for gold, and there were no laws protecting California Indians at that time. By the end of the gold rush, there were maybe 15,000 of them left. Most of what we know about California Indians, in fact, other than what archaeologists know, is what we know since this time period. So you can only imagine how much culture on the part of California Indians, how many memories, how much local knowledge, how many stories, even how many communities of people just disappeared altogether without ever leaving a record, and we'll never know anything about them. But we do know, anthropologists, for example, like Kroeber, Roland Dixon, a number of others, the turn of the century, John Peabody Harrington, spent their lives visiting Native California communities and talking with them about their ideas about nature, their ideas about religion, their ancestral cultures, and so forth. They began to piece together the ideas of these ancient peoples about how their world came into existence. These stories are very long. They were made to be told in their ceremonial houses all winter. And so they were made to go on and on and on and on. And if any of you ever heard a Native American storytelling session, it can go on for a day. I mean, it goes on forever. So these stories were very long, and I'm just going to read you a few lines out of a few of them, because just about how they began, because it will give you some idea of the ways in which the flood story was imagined here in California, the arrival of water. This is from the Yuki Indians of Mendocino County, a group that was studied in the 1930s by George Foster, a Berkeley anthropologist. Two Berkeley anthropologists running out the door. They have competing obligations, but they at least came for the first part. The Yuki flood myth begins. In the beginning, everything was water. On the water, on a fleck of foam, a down feather circled. From this came a voice and singing. This was the Creator who was to make the world. His name means, he who goes alone. With him was the god Coyote. After a time, the god who was in the feather came to look like a man. So we have the beginning of people. All the time that he was taking on the appearance of man, he was singing. Then he made a basket from parts of his own body. From this basket he made the earth, which he fastened and strengthened with pine pitch. Then he traveled over it 4 times. 4 was the sacred number of California people. They used 4 for everything in their stories. He traveled over it 4 times from north to south with Coyote hanging to his body. Next, he fastened the 4 corners of the earth and made the sky from the skins of 4 whales. Then he made people by laying sticks of wood in a house overnight. In the morning, these sticks turned into people. Anachimawe's story from Shasta County in Northern California begins this way. In the very beginning, all was water. The sky, as far as one could see, was clear. It did not have any stars or clouds or anything in it. Then one day a cloud formed in it. It grew lumpy, and it turned into Coyote. Next a fog arose. It grew lumpy and became the silver fox, and they became persons. And as they became persons, person is used in these stories to include any living creature. They hadn't yet differentiated between what we call persons and animals. Here's one of the Wiyot people of Humboldt County up in Northern California. The old man above made some people a long time ago. They were the very first people created, but they weren't right. They couldn't talk right, and they were all furry. How am I going to get rid of them, thought the old man above. Then he decided what he would do. He would cause water to cover all the earth. Condor knew it was going to happen, but no one else did. He and his sister wove a large, deep basket. It took a long time to finish, but at last it was ready. Then when the flood came, they both got in this basket, and it closed tight. They felt it being tossed around by the waves. When it at last ceased to move, Condor decided it had anchored, so he and his sister pushed open the cover and stepped out. The flood had subsided. All around them was land, but there were no people. So the variety of these stories, but the way that land comes into existence is either because the waters recede and a mountaintop will appear, and most mountaintops, most highest points of land around California feature in local creation stories as the place where the waters subsided first. Either that, or the Earthmaker found something floating in the water that could then be turned into land. Either that, or the Earthmaker sent some kind of a creature like a turtle or a bird or something like that to swim way, way, way down into the bottom of the ocean, try to get something and bring that something up, and once they brought it up, it had the magical power, or the Creator had the magical power to multiply this little tiny piece of something into what then became the physical landscape. Now, perhaps the best documented and the most interesting of all of the California, most interesting because it's the best documented, stories of all California people was recorded by a Harvard anthropologist named Roland Dixon, who spent a lot of time in California in the summers of 1902 and 1903, talking with people who lived up in the northern Sierras in Plumas County, Lassen County, primarily the Maidu speakers, the Maidu people who lived in that area and who still live in that area. Dixon was also a linguist, and he recorded pages and pages and pages of text of Maidu stories and Maidu myths in their own language, but being a linguist, he was also able to translate these. He learned all of his mythology from a Maidu man whose English name was Tom Young, and whose Maidu name was Hanshabaijim, which I put up here on the board. In the 1950s, a linguist from UC Santa Cruz, a man by the name of William Shipley, came up and began working on the Maidu language and spent quite a number of years working with Maidu speakers so that he was able to understand as well as he could from a linguist's point of view what was left of that language. So Shipley then went back to Roland Dixon's old creation stories and retranslated them. The stories, they're fairly similar in many ways, but Shipley understood the language better than Roland Dixon did, but Roland Dixon wrote it down accurately. And so Shipley translated this, and it came out about 10 years ago as this book, The Maidu Indian Myths and Stories of Hanshabaijim. Tom Young, who was this Maidu informant who lived in Genesee, California, in Plumas County, his Maidu name was Hanshabaijim, and so that's why Shipley gives the book that title. It was published by Heyday Books here in Berkeley. It's a wonderful book. You can get it at Cody's or Black Oak Book Place. If there's one thing you want to buy, that might be it. So I'm just going to say a few words now. I'm just going to read a few words out of the beginning of the Maidu creation story as collected by Roland Dixon from Tom Young, and then as translated by William Shipley more recently. The Earthmaker, they say, when this world was covered with water, floated and looked about him. As he floated and looked about, he did not see anywhere, indeed, even a tiny bit of land. No various creatures of any kind, none at all, were flying about. And thus he traveled over this world, over the engulfed land. It seemed transparent, like the land and the meadows of heaven. And he felt sad, they say. How I wonder, in what place I wonder, where I wonder, in what sort of place might we too see a bit of land. That's we too, as in TWO. In other words, there's someone else there with the Earthmaker while he's telling this story. A lot of inside information that people who know the stories pick up right away. This is what he asked. Well, you are very powerful. This is what the other asked, who was there. Well, you are very powerful to have thought this world into being. Imagine where in this world some land might be then, and when you have done so, let us too float to that place. I know where that place is, and I can show you a photograph slide of it a little later on. In another Maidu story from a group not too far away from this, it was a different place. It was the Marysville or the Sutter Buttes. Any of you who've driven up into the Sacramento Valley, up towards Chico or Northern California that way, you've seen the Marysville or Sutter Buttes. That's another place where the Earthmaker kind of originally began to restore the world. Okay, imagine where in this world some land might be then, and when you have done so, let us too float to that place. If in this world you keep floating and looking around you, hungering but indeed eating nothing, you will die of hunger, I fear, said the other. So Earthmaker was being kind of scolded by this other presence. Then Earthmaker pondered. I shall not starve, he said. There's nothing I don't know. We should put him on the faculty. The world is very big, it is true. If somewhere or other I should see a bit of earth, then I shall make something good of it. Thereupon he sang, and I won't sing the song, but 3 hours maybe. Where are you, little bit of earth? He said it singing. He kept singing and singing. Enough, he said. He stopped singing. Then Coyote, who was the other, said, Earthmaker and Coyote were sort of like pairs, antagonistic pairs. Coyote said, indeed, there are not many songs that I don't know. And then after that, he sang, and he kept on singing and singing. Where is the land, he asked, and he sang and he sang. Enough, I'm tired, he said, you try again. And then they say Earthmaker sang, oh, where are you, my great mountain ranges, oh, mountains of my world, where are you? Then enough, he said to Coyote, see what you can do. Coyote tried, he kept on singing. If indeed we shall see nothing at all traveling about the world, then perhaps there may be no misty mountain ranges there. Earthmaker said, if I could but see a little bit of land, I might do something very good with it. Floating along then, they saw something like a bird's nest floating in the water. Earthmaker said, it really is small. It would be good if it were a little bigger, but it is really small. I wonder how I might stretch it apart a little. What would be good to do? In what way can I make it a little bigger? As he talked, he transformed it. The Earthmaker stretched it out to where the day breaks. He stretched it out to the south. He stretched it out to the place where the sun goes down. He stretched it out to the north country. He stretched it out to the rim of the world. He stretched it out. A bird nest by a killdeer, a little bird that lives in that area. When Earthmaker had stretched it out, he said, good. You who saw this old earth, this mud, and made this thing, this nest, sing. Telling old tales, humans will say of you, in ancient times, the being who was meadowlark, killdeer and meadowlark are the same bird. In ancient times, the being who was meadowlark, making the land and sticking it together in just that way, built the nest from which the world was made. So then the story goes on for many, many episodes about how they hadn't made it bigger yet, and they hadn't made it bigger yet. Earthmaker and Coyote continue to stretch this bird nest until finally they created the continents as they are today. So that gives you some idea of the variation, but also the similarity of creation stories in California, and of the dominance of water, of course, in the ideas about how the world is created. Next, I want to talk a little bit about a Maidu shaman from the same area. When William Shipley was doing his linguistic work in Northern California, he ran across an old man there by the name of Dan Williams, who spoke the language, so he worked with him as a linguistic informant. But as he began to learn more and more about Mr. Williams, he also began to understand that Mr. Williams was more than a usual human being, that he was the person in that area that people with illnesses went. He was that person that knew the spirits. In the course of his lifetime, he had made many, many alliances with different kinds of spiritual visionary powers. He was a very powerful shaman, turns out to have been the last of his kind in that part of California. And Dan Williams told Shipley in Maidu, when he translated it, how it was that he got this power. And the story, how it was that he got this power, is in a way, it's a replay of the earth diver element of the creation story. We were there at Mountain Pool. I don't know how many of you have ever been up to the area of say, Greenville or Quincy or Westwood, that part of Northern California. But up there in the mountains that lie between Greenville and Westwood, near the top of one of those mountains, there's an amazing lake. It's called Homer Lake. And if you manage to get up there, it's a difficult climb, but if you ever manage to get up there and you look around at that lake, you will feel that there's something strange and different about this place. It doesn't seem like it belongs there, way up at the top of a mountain, but there it is. And it's a very strange looking place, and no Native Americans from that area would ever want to spend the night there. They get out when the sun starts to go down. But anyway, it's to this lake that Dan Williams went when he decided that he was going to try to see whether or not he had what it was required. He could do what was required to himself become a shaman. So we were there at Mountain Pool. My father, who was also a shaman, who was standing beside me, said, "You must always believe in yourself. I have brought you around to this place so that you will dive in the pool." So I dived in from a rock out in the middle of the pool. The water seemed to swirl and bubble. Leafy foliage seemed to hit me in the eyes, though it was far off. I came up to the surface, then my father said, "Do that again and make a grab when you are under the water. Perhaps you will grab something. If you do, hang on to it. If all goes well, a charm will be given to you." I dived again. I brought up that charm. I took hold of a charm stone. My father said, "Good, you did very well." Dan Williams did what squirrels and birds and other creatures in the creation stories do when they dive down deep into the water to the very bottom, which is difficult to do, and they scratch and they try to bring up a little piece of the bottom, and when they do, that something has power, that becomes the earth. So that's what Dan Williams did. He successfully brought up something. His father looked at it and he said, you've got the right stuff. A gambling charm has been given you." Then I swam back to shore. My father said, "You will always fare well. Good has been given you on this trial for power, this entering of the pool. You will surpass me." And he, in fact, did go on to become a powerful shaman who could heal people and cure people based on that original experience at the bottom of Homer Lake up there in Plumas County. So we see that the power to heal then is connected to the idea of the origins of the world. It's related to their ideas about curing and their ideas about illness and so forth. But water is also connected to the ideas about death. The anthropologist, the Berkeley anthropologist Isabel Kelly, in the 1930s, worked with Maria Copa, who was a Coast Miwok woman who lived over there in Marin County. And she learned from Maria Copa that the Coast Miwok said that the home of the dead was in the ocean beyond Point Reyes to the west. Maria said, "All the dead went there, good and bad. They were said to go to be with Coyote where the sun goes down. And although these dead might return from the water in the forms such as owls, coyotes, foxes, and whirlwinds, their relatives feared and generally did not welcome them." So the land of the dead among the Miwok peoples of the Marin coast and that general area out there to the west in the sea, that was an idea that was shared by numerous California peoples. The land of the dead was somewhere out in the water. Souls went under the water. Regarding the soul's final journey after death, how its soul reached its destination, another early 20th century anthropologist who was also a biologist, C. Hart Miriam, recorded an Eastern Sierra Miwok account of the soul's movements and its transformations. Miriam was a very interesting person. He studied the morphology, the skeletal morphology, the ecological habits of numerous California land mammals. He also knew the landscape and the ecology of California extremely well, but in all of his travels he became quite interested in Native Americans and accumulated a really impressive corpus of material about their ideas about nature, how they understood it, what they did with it, but also the ideas about just about everything else. Many of his materials are in the Bancroft Library, but the greater part are up at the Special Collections Library at Davis, where the objects, the artifacts that Miriam collected largely are today. So the story that Miriam tells us from an Eastern Sierra Miwok account of the place where souls go after death. When a person dies, the heart spirit remains in the dead body for 4 days. During these 4 days, everyone is quiet, and the children are not allowed to run around or to make a noise. On the morning of the 4th day, the people sprinkle ashes on the ground over the buried basket of burnt bones, over the grave if the corpse were buried instead of burned. On that day, the heart spirit leaves the body in the invisible form of the wind spirit, or the ghost, and it proceeds westward. That night, it may come back in the form of the owl or in some other animal, so look out. Some ghosts are good, others are bad. At last, they all go to the ocean and cross over on a long pole to the roundhouse of the dead, where they remain. The roundhouse was the characteristic ceremonial chamber for California people where most of their healing rituals took place. It is also where their myths were told. Here's a story collected by Robert Oswalt, a Berkeley linguist, about the memory of the first sighting of a European ship by the coastal Pomo, just north of Marin County. The Kashia Pomo, who still live there today on a little reservation. Oswalt tells us, when the Kashia Pomo first saw a sailing ship on their horizon, they thought it was a giant bird that portended the end of the world. Essie Parrish, a Kashia Pomo healer and prophetess, recounted this story in 1958. Essie Parrish's son was a graduate student. Otis Parrish was a graduate student here in the anthropology department until quite recently. And he's gone off to take a job working in a Native American museum. So the links between prehistory and the present among anthropologists are fairly direct. Here's the story. In the old days, before the white people came up here, there was a boat sailing on the ocean from the south. Because before that, they had never seen a boat, they said. This could have been Cabrillo, it could have been Drake, who knows. They said, our world must be coming to an end. Couldn't we do something? This big bird floating on the ocean is from somewhere. Let us plan a feast. Let us have a dance. They followed its course with their eyes to see what it would do. Having done so, they promised our father a feast, saying that destruction was upon them. Now you remember that one of the ways in which the soul returns is in the form of an owl or in some other bird. And so that's the way that the Kashia Pomo, rather, interpreted in their own oral tradition, interpreted their first sighting of Europeans. Robert Heiser, another Berkeley anthropologist, in trying to analyze Francis Drake's account of his interactions with Native Americans at Point Reyes in 1769, describes the trembling and the fear and the awe that the Native Americans had of Drake's people when they got off the ship. And Heiser also explains the response on the part of the Miwok of the Point Reyes area to Drake, as accounted in Drake's journals, in terms of their having believed, and I think that he's right, that what was really happening with Drake was that the spirits of the dead had returned, and that made them very nervous. Associations of water with death are also seen in other contexts. The northeastern Maidu, again, I'm using that as an example because there are so many people who've written about it, and I myself have done about 10 years of field work in that part of California. When a northeastern Maidu person is ready to die, and it's not uncommon for other California people to feel the same way, feels that the time has come for them to die, If they're not living in their ancestral territory or their ancestral tribelet, if they're living in San Jose and they come from Shasta or something like that, they want to get back because that's the place where they should die. And in the earliest historic times, even in California myths, when a person died away from their territory, the corpse was carried back to their home where the rituals were performed and it was either then buried or cremated. So they had a very, very strong sense of where they came from and the appropriateness of dying, or if they couldn't die, of nevertheless being buried in that place. But part of what they had to do when they returned to that place, part of their purpose of going there, the first thing that they wanted to do, the first thing a Maidu would say when they get back to where they come from, is that they want to drink the water. That's the first thing they want to do when they're back. Somehow that prepares them to die. And at the same time, at Maidu funerals even today, and this is variation other areas, but at Maidu funerals today, even if it's a Christian burial with a coffin and the rest of it, the deceased is buried holding a glass of water from their home territory to drink as they go off to the land of the dead. It helps them to get there. Now here's an interesting story. In 1906, the anthropologist Samuel Barrett, who did a lot of field work around Northern California, coastal peoples, after the earthquake, he went straight up into Northern California to talk with some Wintun shamans from that area to ask how they interpreted the earthquake, what that meant to them. You can see that anthropology is a really interesting thing to do. He went up, he knew two Wintun shamans who lived in the western foothills of the Sacramento Valley, asked what they thought of the recent earthquake that had devastated San Francisco. Interestingly, one shaman saw it as a sign that the world was about to be leveled like the Wintun abode of the dead. The other saw it as a continuation of the stretching process that we saw in the Maidu creation story, where the creator is pulling it this way and he's pulling it that way and he's pulling it this way to make the bird nest, the whale skin, and whatever it is cover the earth. The other shaman saw it as a continuation of the stretching process also present in the Maidu creation story that made the world large enough for all the people who would live in it. And so here's what the shaman told them. The world was originally much smaller than at present. As the Indian population in the past increased, the earth was stretched by Old Man Coyote, the southern Wintun Earthmaker, in order to make room for the newcomers. These disturbances, in other words, the shaking of the 1906 earthquake, was the consequence of the earth being stretched by Earthmaker or Coyote or whoever does that. These disturbances were the forerunners of another stretching of the earth, this time in order to make room for the ever-increasing white population. He was of the opinion, however, that immediately all the Indians will be dead, which they very well soon will be, according to him. This catastrophe, when it comes, will totally destroy all things on earth and render it like the Wintun world of the dead. In other words, level it back to water. Another anthropologist, Cora Dubois, who also studied at Berkeley, went off to Harvard, became a very distinguished specialist in the anthropology of India, collected a story of another Wintun woman in Northern California. She was interested in the ways in which the Native Americans had kind of understood to themselves the enormous changes that had taken place on the California landscape. Gold mining, placer mining, blasting, plowing, dynamiting up boulders, I mean, all the types of things that happened. Rerouting rivers, dams, I mean, the huge architectural and landscape features that European culture, the European civilization, the changes that it brought to California, was interested in getting the Wintun idea of what this was all about and how they understood it. Here's the story, at least she collected several of these stories, but here's one she collected from a woman whose name was Kate Lucky. When the Indians all die, God will let the water come down from the north. In other words, they were expecting at that point that this would happen, that they would all die. When the Indians all die, God will let the water come down from the north. Everyone will drown. That is because the white people never cared for the land or the deer or the bear. When we Indians kill meat, we eat it all up. When we dig roots, we make little holes. When we build houses, we make little holes. When we burn grass for grasshoppers, They ate grasshoppers. We don't ruin things. We shake down acorns and pine nuts. We don't chop down the trees. We use only dead wood. But the white people plow up the ground, they pull up the trees, they kill everything. The tree says, don't, I'm sore, don't hurt me. But they chop it down and they cut it up. The spirit of the land hates them. They blast out trees and stir it up to its depths. They soar up the trees. That hurts them. They blast rocks and scatter them on the earth. The rock says, don't, you're hurting me. But the white people pay no attention. When the Indians use rocks, they take little round ones for their cooking. That is, for cooking acorn mush. They cook acorn mush by dropping hot rocks in the mush and cook it that way. When the Indians use rocks, they take little round ones for their cooking. The white people dig long tunnels. Eventually, she says, the water will come. The earth will end, and the way that the earth will end is by the water returning. So it gives you an idea then that creation is a very unfinished business with California Indian people. It can happen over and over again. As the earth gets tired, worn, and so forth, the cycle repeats itself. I mentioned that, that ideas about creation organized the ways in which societies were organized, and I won't go into any great length on this, but C. Miriam, the anthropologist and the naturalist, did a lot of work on this topic, and he wrote a little article in the Sierra Club Quarterly in 1917 on the locations of Indian villages in the Yosemite Valley. And he located 37 Indian villages in Yosemite Valley from Living's Yosemite Miwok. And after a while, he figured out something, that even though each of these villages was named for a different animal, some of them were grouped together. And all of those north of the Merced River were the bear villages, and they were the ground people, the earth people. And all of those to the south of the Merced River were the water villages, the coyote people. All of those to the south were the coyote people, and these were the water villages. To the north, they were the bear people, and they were the land villages. What he finally figured out was that this classification had to do with their creation story. Coyote came into the world with the flood, and these other creatures related to the bear came into the world once land was created. So this distinction between land and water explained the ways in which the actual locations of villages, how these villages were named and located in Yosemite Valley. And the valley of the Yosemite name itself is derived from the local Miwok word for bear, referring to that part of the north side of the Merced River, which was where the bear people lived. So you can see then that even native geography was heavily influenced by these kinds of ideas. One last sort of mythical anecdote, and that is that woman Liana Morales of Susanville, California, whose mother was born and whose son is still living, knew the Maidu creation story, the wanderings of the Maidu creator, and how all the different mountains and rivers and lakes and features of the landscape had been established in that part of California. And she told a wonderful story, and she actually recorded much of it so that it's actually available on a tape recording. But as the Earthmaker reached the end of his journey, and he came over the Sierras above the Honey Lake Valley looking over the city of Susanville, the Earthmaker, as he went along, was carrying a long staff. As he carried the staff, he said to himself, I want to make some wonderful water for my people who will live here. So he took this staff and he rammed it into the earth in several places. And out of this earth, above the Susan River, at the foothills of the Sierra, out came these wonderful, huge springs of water where Maidus camped in historic times, and they always understood that these springs were created by the Earthmaker as he walked over, discovered that valley, and prepared it from their habitation. The Maidu will have a kind of an open secret as well, and that is that when the municipal waterworks of Susanville, or whatever it's called, went about creating drinking water facilities for drinking water and for purifying water and the rest of it, what they did was to build pumps over these original springs so that those holes that were created by the creator's staff are now the springs that supply the waterworks of the city of Susanville, and the Maidu all know that. So they have no problem getting the most sacred water whenever they need it. All they have to do is turn on the tap. Okay, when we get down to practical uses of water, I'm only going to give you one example of that. I'm going to mention to you one source. After you've read William Shipley's The Maidu Indian Myths for the Creation Stories, if those of you who are not familiar with Thomas Jefferson Mayfield's Indian Summer, I strongly recommend that. The original book was published by the Tulare Times Press in 1926. It's an amazing story. There was a kind of a folklorist, antiquarian, collector, school teacher who lived in the San Joaquin Valley down in the Fresno area, whose name was Frank Lotta, L-O-T-T-A. And he learned of an old white man who was somewhere in his middle 80s, this was back in the 1920s, who was raised by Yokuts Indians not too far from Tulare Lake. And the story was that when this individual's parents and family came to California during the gold rush, his father had fought at the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. When they came to California, his mother died, and his father had some kind of business, I don't know what it was exactly, but it didn't involve raising his children. And he took this little boy, who was then 8 years old, and he consigned him to a Choyumni Yokuts rancheria on the Kings River down in the San Joaquin Valley. And from the age of 8 until the age of 18, this boy grew up among the Yokuts. His father was off doing whatever he did, riding around. Occasionally, a year, 2 years, 3 years, he'd come back for a few minutes and say hello and move on. So he basically was raised as a Southern Valley Yokut. He spoke the language. He was raised in a family. He knew the things they knew. And when Frank Latter discovered this person, he was in a nursing home and he was near death, but he talked to him for a summer. He interviewed him at great length, and the man wanted to talk because in those days, speaking English with an Indian accent was something that you weren't proud of, it's something you were ashamed of, and having been raised by Native Americans and being a white person was not something that you bragged about. And so having Frank Latter come and suddenly, you know, Latter himself realized that he had found a treasure. I mean, this man there will never be another Californian like this person. He opened up with Latter and he told him a story. He narrated his entire childhood. He remembered it very, very well. Latter wrote it down. He published it in 1926, I think it is, in the Tulare Times, in a little book called San Joaquin Primeval. That's the title. San Joaquin Primeval, Uncle Jeff's Story. The man's name was Uncle Jeff. It's a wonderful, wonderful, I would say that's my favorite book of California. I have a little list of favorite books of California, and I'm constantly reordering it, but I'd put that very high on the list. But in any event, a lot of what Thomas Jefferson Mayfield says about his life with the Yokuts has to do with water. It has to do with bathing, it has to do with a whole variety of things, fishing. And I'll just read you a couple of examples. Talks about how they make acorn by simply pounding the flour and then leaching out the tannic acid with water. You probably have all heard about that. He says the Indians were very careful about polluting a stream near their rancheria. If they had to wade into the stream, they would do so below the camp, so they might cross on the rocks above. The sweat hose was located below camp, and all bathing was done there. They would seldom wash their hands and face in a stream. When drinking from a stream, they would arise with their mouth full of water. Then they would allow this water to run over their hands and would in that way wash their hands and face. Children were taught not to fear the water. I've just picked out a few random excerpts here. I've seen the Mokies, which is their word for woman. I've seen the Mokies take their babies down to the river when they were only a few days old. They would hold them on their open hands, dip their backs in the water. If the child was startled by the water, they would talk to it and reassure it. Then they would dip it in again and again until it was not afraid to go completely under. Sometimes when the baby was dipped underwater, it would come up coughing, but the mother would talk to it and dip it in again until it lost all fear. They would then teach it to swim by holding it partly out of the water. Many of the Indian children could swim almost as soon as they could walk. In fact, many of the children were kept strapped to the cradle for so long that I believe they could swim before they could walk. Sometimes the Mokies would place a child in deep water alone long before it could walk. They would bend a willow branch down to the water and allow the child to hold on to it. They would then go on about their work and sometimes pay no attention to it for a quarter hour or more. We parked children in front of TVs, you know, at that age, and anyway, the Yokuts had another way of doing it. But nevertheless, if you want to read something that really is descriptive about California Indian life and their interactions with nature, and particularly their uses of water, I recommend the Mayfield book. Now I'd like to go through a few slides. I've got about 25 slides. We'll go through them quickly, give you some idea of the diversity of importance of water with California. This Contested Eden book that I put on the board, by the way, is very worth reading, primarily because it has a chapter by me, and the bibliography to that chapter has just about everything you'd ever want to read about Native California people. I put in just about everything I know, so if you want a really huge bibliography, that's the place to look. Okay. Let's see. Did it go on? No.
There.
Okay. A Tachi Yokut's water basket from down around the Santa Rosa Rancheria, known today for a huge gambling casino, but in the little village of Santa Rosa, there are still Yokut basket makers who are very good at making baskets. That's one that ended up at the Hearst Museum, that it was built particularly for carrying water. Roland Dixon collected a whole bunch of turn-of-the-century California Indian material culture that's now in storage at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. And this is a trout trap, or trout net rather, that Nixon collected somewhere up around the Yuba River. Another trout trap, a photograph taken by Edward Curtis among the Hoopa of Northern California, shows some of the elaborate structures that were used in that area for fishing. Salmon trap, another Curtis photograph, Northern California from the Yurok people, again showing a very complex structure for salmon fishing. A way of a platform. Sometimes these were built on rocks on the side of the river, sometimes they were built in the river, but a fairly characteristic way of Central California Indian fishing. Acorn Processing from Hutchings, California magazine, the 19th century, and the foothills of the Western Sierra. Acorn gathering. But the reason I'm showing you the acorn scene is because the acorn processing itself involves creating a pool, sometimes lining the bottom of that pool with some kind of a filter, but then placing the acorn meal inside and then leaching it over and over again with hot water to clean out the tannic acid. So it was an important part of their everyday cooking practices. A variety of watercraft in California, probably the most spectacular being the large sewn plank canoes used by the Chumash and native peoples in the Santa Barbara coast area. But this is up in Northern California among the Yurok, large dugout log canoe. They were not uncommon throughout Northern California. This is another Curtis photograph from the Bancroft Library. Illustration of a Thule balsa canoe or raft here in San Francisco Bay. This one was done by a Russian or a Danish artist on a Russian expedition in 1816 to the Mission Dolores in San Francisco. This artist did a number of really, really wonderful pictures, drawings of watercolors of California Indian life around the mission, but including this Thule balsa raft in San Francisco Bay. A northern Sacramento Valley village with acorn granaries next to the houses in the background, mid-19th century. And down in the foreground, you can see a couple of tule balsa rafts also sewn together, ready to be tossed out into the river for some water travel. Native California peoples were involved in the gold rush. It's an interesting little, not very well known aspect of the gold rush. The first people to the gold fields tended to be the rancheros, that is, the people who were the Spanish ranching population of California. And most of the rancheros had large communities of Native Americans that had once been with the missions that were now living on their ranches, and they were a source of labor to them. And so when the rancheros went off to the gold fields, they brought their Indian workers with them. And they put them all to work with their baskets. I guess they didn't have gold pans that early in the gold rush. They put them to work in the rivers, working for them. And then when the Americans arrived and they saw the rancheros with their huge Indian workforces, they decided that was unfair. So they chased them all out of the gold fields, and the Americans took them over. They felt that was fair. More Native Americans, this time with a gold pan, working somewhere up in the Sacramento Valley area. Placer mining. This is the kind of thing that Kate Lucky was talking about. A kind of a gold rush illustration, I guess, that was meant to excite people back east, but it shows the variety of ethnic groups that were working in the gold fields in the early years. Chinese, and then we have two Native Americans working there in that large sort of basket. I'm not sure what that is exactly, but they are nevertheless Native Americans. This is interesting. I mentioned the Earthmaker story told by Liana Morales up in Northern California about where the Earthmaker put his stick into the ground. The last place where the Earthmaker stopped, when finally he decided that this was the end of the boundary of the territory where his people were going to live, was the place where there was a hot spring, and he also created that. This hot spring is now used for some kind of commercial or public purposes, and there's some kind of a huge plant that's built on top of it. I'm not sure exactly what they even do with it, but I guess it produces electrical energy or something. I never did find out. It didn't occur to me actually to ask what happens with the power, but up until the time when whatever this electrical utility was made out of it was used by shamans and various other ill people, native people from all over California. Who'd come to the spring, they'd lie in the mud, they had certain rituals they'd perform. And the water itself was responsible to the powers of people that visited the area. If a shaman was an evil shaman who could cause illness, the water would rise up and get violent. But if it was a good shaman that wouldn't injure people, the water would just stay there and sort of be nice to them. But this little stream is part of what, in fact, it's the last thing the Earthmaker did, was to create this hot water spring before he left. This mountain, not the one in the foreground, but the one between the two mountains in the rear, the little gray peak you can see, is where Earthmaker and Coyote landed in the Shipley story that I read to you. A Maidu ceremonial house up in the Northern Sierras. This was taken down not too long ago. The Indian woman who owned the property died. The property was sold, and the person who bought it said, "Oh, I don't want that on my property." They took it down. But anyway, wonderful old ceremonial roundhouse that was used for years and years and years. This is the bear dance ceremony, which still goes on up in Northern California. At the very end, the purpose of the ceremony, it's to, among other things, it sort of brings the world to life. It happens every June in a number of different communities in this area. But one element of the ceremony is that the bear goes around and people whip the bear, and they also whip the people that go with the bear. The bear is basically a human with a bear skin over him, as you can see, with pieces of wormwood. And by doing that, all of the bad things in the world, the illnesses, the bad intentions, all the things you want to get rid of go into the wormwood. And when the ceremony is over, the leaders take the wormwood and they go down to a stream and they throw all those wormwood wands away into the water, and all the bad things get washed away for the year. All the bad things that accumulated the year before, they get rid of it. So that's what's happening here. They're about to take all these pieces of wormwood that they're carrying, throw them in the water to wash away the bad stuff. Well, there are a couple of other slides. I thought there were a couple of others of the bear dance ceremony, but that ceremony at least lets you know that the beliefs I'm describing aren't things that have easily gone away. There we go. Many parts of California where Native people still exist, although they exist in modified form and people have become, Protestants and Catholics and whatever, Jehovah's Witnesses. There's still many, many elements of traditional ideas that persist, and still many folk beliefs and ideas about herbal remedies and so forth. It's hard to go into a Northern California kitchen, really, without seeing all sorts of stacks of things in the back and things that get mixed together in certain family crises and emergency. But it's a way of life that still persists and is quite interesting. But anyway, those slides cover everything that I was able to pull together on California Indian. And if there's anything you'd like to know about California Indians that I haven't said, feel free to ask. And if I don't know what it is, there are a couple of people in the back of the
You have 10 minutes for questions and comments.
Well, you can't help but connect these stories of the origin to the Noah's, the Great Flood, Noah's Flood, and
Yeah.
years in Barrett, and all kinds of
Yeah.
literature. So we have evidence, say, for Noah's Flood that it really happened. Sort of reconstruct it. Is there reason to think that where you get these flood stories, there were major floods? Is that part of the state they were in? Were there ever floods that big in California that we interpreted?
Well, the Sacramento River, I think the San Joaquin River, they did flood. And they would even today if it wasn't for all of the what do they call them? They're not dikes, there's another word for it that's used in California. The levees, yeah. I mean, certainly they would flood. I don't know whether you need real floods to have the story. The story's all over. It's even in the Northeast and other parts of North America where there were no floods. So it's hard to say. But these stories have a life of their own. I mean, certainly these stories arrived in North America by way of Asia. I'm sure that they came with people that came across Bering Strait and then just got modified in different ways as they moved around the continent. So a story can begin in one part of the world and end up in another part of the world. It doesn't have to be a historical account of something that happened in that place. But the valley terrain of Northern California is really quite interesting because when it's covered with snow, the valleys look like lakes. The American Valley, for example, Indian Valley, Mountain Meadows. Anyone here familiar with that part of California? The huge areas that at one time were lakes, but by the winter runoff, the lake bottoms filled up with sediment, they filled up with sediment, they filled up with sediment. So finally, in the end, you have flat bottom valleys that's just where the sediment stopped, where it no longer began to accumulate. And they look like lakes. In the winter, when they're covered with snow, they look like lakes. So it's not hard to think that, if you lived up there, that, they might have been fossils of ancient floods.
I just wanted to comment on that. If you go back 8,000 or 10,000 years, it was around 10,000 years ago that we had a transition from glacial climate to warming climate. At that time, the paleoclimate of California was very different. So it is entirely possible that there were periodic episodes of flooding. And we do know that not in the north, but in the south, you go to the Salton Sea Depression, what we now call Salton Sea. That sea came about because of artificial means. But prior to that, there are evidence that 1,000 years ago there was lakes there. So there were these periodic episodes of laking and drying of the depression. So if you go back sufficiently back in time, some of these stories may have some meaning to it.
Yeah, and a lot of the San Joaquin Valley was flooded. The earliest Spanish maps show it as a lake. Lake Fresno. Yes.
I live in Berkeley, and many people are reporting problems of water coming up in their houses for the first time in 20, 30 years. What would California Indians, how would they interpret that? What would they think to tell us as a shaman or whatever?
Good question. I couldn't begin to to speak for them on that one. But if certainly if there was a lot of them, then it would you know could be seen as the water returning. Yeah. Or just simply Earthmaker's creations that have been in some way covered over by asphalt or whatever, you know, other things might have been prevented the water from coming out, just simply asserting itself. I don't know. That's interesting. I didn't know that. So if the flood begins, it may begin in Berkeley. Probably would. Yes?
Can you describe a little more about the Watercraft? You mentioned Santa Barbara.
Yeah. Yeah, they sort of look like a clapboard structure. And the planks are sewn together. And then the seams are sealed by pitch. And they were quite seagoing. I don't know, they could hold 20 or so people. They were pretty large. They were drawn up on the coast all over that area when Cabrillo came in 1542. There's actually one on exhibit at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History. If you ever get down that area, it's really quite interesting to see it. Well, thank you.